1941, winter. The sea was not a shield for the Allies, it was a chasm. The Battle of the Atlantic had become an existential crisis, a campaign of slow, invisible strangulation against the Allied world. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs, moved with unchecked effectiveness, turning the ocean into a vast cold cemetery for Allied shipping. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, some 2,800 merchant ships carrying the food, fuel, and raw materials essential for Britain's survival and America's ability to mobilize vanished beneath the waves. The statistics were abstract, but the reality was visceral. 1940 alone had seen 7.8 million tons of cargo disappear. This figure included the devastating Night of the Long Knives, where 20 vessels were sunk in a single, terrifying month. Initially, the Allied convoys were little more than floating targets. They were protected only by limited naval assets, often ill-equipped and simply too slow to counter the agile German submersibles. Winston Churchill understood the peril better than anyone. Gazing across the breadth of the Atlantic, he warned President Roosevelt that unless the tide turned, the sea soon would become America's cage.
The oceans, once the great defensive moat of the continent, were threatening to become a prison wall.
They risked sealing off the arsenal of democracy entirely. Roosevelt, whose naval experience stretched back to World War I with the splinter fleet of small subchasers, knew the solution lay in smaller, faster warships. His proposal for a dedicated, agile anti-submarine craft, the Destroyer Escort, or DE, was met with immediate resistance from the traditional U.S. Navy brass. The establishment focused on capital ships. They prioritized resources like steel and diesel engines for merchant cargo ships, dismissing the DE concept as a little matter. Admiral Emory S. Land and Lewis W. Douglas argued that building escorts would divert resources from the critical task of constructing cargo hulls. This bureaucratic infighting and traditional skepticism caused a critical delay. It was a missed opportunity that cost Allied shipping invaluable time and thousands of lives. It took the undeniable devastating toll of the U-boat blitz. The March 1943 crisis alone saw German submarines sink 500,000 tons of supplies to force a grim reconsideration. The dire threat proved Churchill right. It ultimately compelled the Navy to commit to the mass production of the Destroyer Escort, a mighty little ship that could. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 provided the necessary catastrophic catalyst. A wave of patriotic fervor surged across the nation. The young men, many barely out of their teens, some as young as 16, rushed to recruiting offices. They sought to trade the perceived muddy trenches of the army for the promise of a free meal and a clean sack in the Navy. The mobilization effort was immense and immediate. Recruiters would take you as long as you were upright and warm. Walter Roberge, a 16-year-old from a generation where a penny bought something and 3 pennies bought a lot, was desperate to serve. He lied about his age. He forged his birth certificate with a doctored document that bore a slight ink mismatch. The Navy, needing bodies, overlooked the flaw. William Reamer, a high school dropout at 17, enlisted with a raw, pragmatic ignorance of naval life. All he knew was that the pointed end of the boat went first. This influx of new bluejackets overwhelmed the existing infrastructure at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center, a sprawling 1,440-acre complex north of Chicago, was a site of chaotic 24/7 construction. Recruits arriving in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor found basic needs unmet. Long chow lines snaked across the frozen grounds. There was no heat or hot water, and insufficient clothing was commonplace. The water intake valve famously froze, requiring a diver to descend into the frigid depths of Lake Michigan just to keep the facility running. New stations authorized in 1942, like Sampson and Bainbridge, were built at a relentless pace. They were often described as flimsy operations, where barracks were mere shells heated by temperamental coal stoves. The initial boot camp experience was a rude awakening. Training periods were drastically shortened, sometimes to just 3 weeks. The focus was the relentless pace of go, go, go from reveille to lights out. Robert Homan found the experience degrading. He recounted hours spent tying knots, memorizing the Blue Jackets manual, the recruit's Bible, and preparing for inspections where sheets had to be so tight that a $50 would bounce on them. For young men accustomed to comfort, the shock was immediate. The chief boatswain's mate, delivered a harsh lesson to one privileged recruit. "From now on, you will be my maid," he declared. Yet, these were the men the nation would pin its future on. By January 1943, the first destroyer escort, outfitted with the latest sonar, radar, and anti-submarine weapons, finally went to sea. The design emphasized maneuverability and cost-effectiveness for mass production. These ships had almost the same firepower as destroyers, but could be built quickly and in vast numbers. The American industrial engine, bolstered by Roosevelt's commitment to Lend-Lease, was now fully engaged, employing 640,000 Americans in shipbuilding. The bridge of ships began to form. The first of the 563 destroyer escorts that would ultimately be produced steamed out into the dark, churning waters of the North Atlantic. They were small, agile, and indomitable, destined to confront the unseen enemy lurking below. They would transform the tide of the war one convoy at a time. The crisis of 1943 was a violent, undeniable ledger of loss. With U-boats sinking an average of 3 ships daily, and the March Blitz costing the Allies over 500,000 tons of vital supplies, the American naval establishment could no longer afford its bureaucratic inertia. Winston Churchill's desperate pleas, delivered during his visits to Roosevelt, had been prescient. The oceans were fast becoming America's cage. The Navy was forced to pivot, finally prioritizing the production of the destroyer escort over competing demands for landing barges and synthetic rubber. The man who would translate this urgent military necessity into tangible steel was William Francis Gibbs, a self-taught naval architect and head of Gibbs & Cox. Gibbs, nicknamed the Undertaker for his perpetual black suit and tie, a choice born of efficiency, he served as a $1-a-year man, refusing compensation, driven solely by the race against time. His philosophy was that designing a ship is like keeping 9 balls in the air all at one time. His method was revolutionary. At his simple drafting table, his firm created meticulous 1/8 scale models, reproducing every internal machine and pipe. This allowed engineers to identify and correct design flaws visually before a single keel was laid. This cinematic approach to shipbuilding streamlined the process, coordinating government boards and accelerating procurement. Gibbs's system of prefabrication was the engine of the bridge of ships. The approximately 300-foot-long DEs with their 35-foot beams were built in 13 prefabricated sections. Some of these sections weighed 80 to 4,000 pounds. This method slashed the construction time from a projected year down to 7 months. The machinery plans for diesel-driven DEs were finalized in remarkable sprints, 73, 85, and 98 days. This was a testament to the industrial mobilization. The British DE, HMS Fitzroy, achieved an astonishing record, completion in just 8.5 days from keel laying. The industrial might of the United States was finally focused, and the results were immediate. By the end of 1943, the Navy's projected goal of 270 details was completed a full month ahead of schedule. These ships were trim but deadly, not merely scaled-down destroyers. They were purpose-built anti-submarine warfare platforms. They possessed almost the same firepower as their larger cousins, but they were smaller, more maneuverable, and critically cost-effective for mass production. This agility, combined with a suite of new ASW technologies, transformed them into superior U-boat hunters. They utilized the Hedgehog forward-launching bombs, the terrifying concussive power of depth charges nicknamed ashcans, and sensitive new sonar systems. The strategic shift was formalized with the creation of the 10th Fleet. This unique, shipless fleet operated entirely from shore. Its personnel fought the war huddled over desks, centralizing intelligence and coordinating the deployment of these new vessels into deadly hunter-killer groups. The DEs were now the true teeth of the Allied defense. The turning point was visceral, marked by oil slicks and muffled underwater explosions. On April 26, 1944, the USS Frost, a destroyer escort deployed in a hunter-killer group, tracked U-488. This German milk cow submarine was a vital artery of the campaign, tasked with resupplying the wolf packs with fuel, provisions, and mail. The U-boat was running deep in the North Atlantic. The Frost's crew, young and green but operating with the precision of seasoned veterans, relentlessly pummeled the area with depth charges. Confined to their dark shack, the sonar operators learned to interpret the terrifying ping that signaled the enemy's presence. They listened for the subsequent groan of the sub's hull under pressure. When the attacks ceased, the sea itself provided the confirmation. A 7-mile-long oil slick bloomed across the surface. It was thick and black, spreading an unmistakable stench that smelled like an oil refinery. It was the death marker of U-488. The sinking was a validation of the entire DE program. Superior maneuverability, cost-effective mass production, and specialized anti-submarine weaponry had finally halted the massive slaughter of Allied and merchant vessels. The agility of the Ds, their smaller turning circle, and their array of weapons made them the ideal counter to the claustrophobic dance of submarine warfare. These weapons were specifically designed to explode on contact or at precise depths. The U-boat commanders, once the masters of the Atlantic, felt the shift immediately. Captain Herbert A. Werner noted the sharp increase in U-boat losses in March 1943. He observed that the hunters had become the hunted. Through the rest of the war, he realized, their boats were slaughtered at a fearful rate. Over 30,000 German sailors would ultimately find their graves at the bottom of the sea. The DEs were no longer just defensive screens. They were now the aggressors. They embodied the courage, durability, and steadfastness that the Navy had pinned its future on. These tough little ships, crewed by teenage bluejackets and their young officers, had neutralized the U-boat threat. They ensured the security of the crucial supply lines. The deployment of the DEs in large numbers, starting in January 1943, was the strategic shift that allowed the Allies to breathe. It paved the way for major invasions and ensured that the oceans would remain a shield, not a cage. The mighty little ship that could had finally turned the tide. The technological race beneath the waves was a constant, nerve-shredding game of cat and mouse. German U-boats, once masters of the dark, silent depths, were now hunted by the relentless ping of Allied sonar. This sonar was guided by decoded Enigma intelligence and the precision of high-frequency direction finding, or HUFDUF. The U-boat crews, often pallid, haggard, and filthy after months at sea, countered with their own innovations. They utilized the primitive Metox receiver, a handheld device with a funnel and germanium crystal. This allowed them to detect Allied radar signals from surface escorts. This initial advantage meant U-boats could often evade detection when running on the surface at night. It was a critical defense until the Allies refined their own technology. For the destroyer escort crews, the battle was one of acute sensory deprivation punctuated by explosive violence. Sonar operators, confined to the dark shack, learned to distinguish the subtle nuances of underwater sound. They had to identify the familiar clang of a fishing trawler, the ghostly echo of an Allied ship, and the terrifying metallic moss of a U-boat contact. When the USS Jenks, pursuing a possible contact, pushed its speed too high, the rush of water around the hull often drowned out the sonar's effectiveness. It was a constant reminder that the ocean itself was the great enemy, an unpredictable, unforgiving medium. The tension was a constant, low thrum of anxiety. Sailors on watch had to slap each other and sing to fight off the sleep that could cost a convoy its life. The ships were cramped vessels, often out at sea for months, measuring about 300 feet long and 35 feet wide. Men lived out of sea bags due to the lack of lockers, performing endless chores like swabbing decks and chipping paint. They were battling the uncanny boredom that Ernie Pyle observed, but the monotony was always a prelude to the abyss. Then there was the ultimate prize, intelligence. Captain Daniel V. Gallery, commanding the USS Guadalcanal Task Group, harbored an audacious, almost unheard-of ambition. He declared, "I want to capture this bastard, if possible." Conventional wisdom dictated that U-boats must be sunk to protect the convoy, but Gallery saw the potential for a windfall of intelligence that could shorten the war. On June 4, 1944, Easter Sunday Eve, just days before the massive invasion of Normandy, Gallery's group tracked U-505, the submarine, commanded by Captain Lang, had been damaged by depth charges, its hull compromised and rudder jammed. As Allied fighter planes strafed the U-boat to disable it without sinking it, German sailors scrambled into the churning ocean waters. They cried out, "Save us, comrades, save us!" Boatswain's mate Zenon Lukosius, one of the 9-man boarding party from the USS Pillsbury, dropped into the U-boat's hatch. The atmosphere was immediate and overwhelming. The quarters were eerily dark and cramped, permeated by an unforgettable stink of diesel, oil, bilge water, and the foul, inescapable smell of the head. Below, the chief engineer, believing his ship was sinking, had managed to replace a sea strainer cap. He muttered a resigned, "Here goes nothing," before abandoning his post. Unwittingly, he prevented the scuttling charges from being fully armed. The boarding party moved frantically, battling the flooding seawater and the fear of demolition bombs. Torpedoman Arthur Knispel, working against the clock and the rising water, frantically searched for and disarmed the explosives. The prize was immense. They recovered confidential documents, codebooks, manuals, and most critically, the Enigma machine. One sailor initially dismissed the device as an old radio, but Phil Trusheim recognized its immense value. They had secured a half-ton of documents and equipment that would significantly aid Allied decryption efforts and ASW strategies. The capture of U-505 was a dramatic, high-stakes success. It was the first enemy vessel captured by the U.S. Navy since 1815. It was a major turning point, a symbol of the shift in power. Captain Gallery, who had described submarine hunting as big game hunting, finally had his moment of all hell busts loose. He noted that 99% of the time, it is a most monotonous and discouraging occupation. As the captured U-boat was secured, a giant American flag was placed triumphantly on its periscope. It was a stark visual of the new reality. The hunters had become the hunted. The sheer scale of the conflict, however, extended beyond technology and intelligence. It was a war fought across every social and racial fault line in America. The young crews of the DEs fought the enemy. African-American sailors often had to fight for the right to fight. Systemic racial discrimination was deeply entrenched in the United States Navy. Secretary Frank Knox had famously held the prejudiced belief that black sailors could not maintain discipline above the rank of messman. Yet the relentless need for manpower, combined with the tireless advocacy of figures like Mary McLeod Bethune, forced a gradual thaw. Political pressure from Executive Order 8802 also helped crack the institution's rigid shell. James Graham, an African-American recruit, stood firm when a recruiter suggested he become a mess attendant. "I won't cook or clean up behind anyone," he stated plainly. "My sister does that for me." His stand was a clear rejection of the institutionalized racism that dominated the service. Their slow, painful progress culminated in the commissioning of the USS Mason on March 21, 1944. It was the first U.S. Navy warship manned by a predominantly black crew, featuring 204 African-American sailors and 44 white officers. They were scrutinized immediately, viewed by the Navy brass as a floating laboratory for democracy. James Graham perceived the prevailing mood perfectly. "They didn't want us to succeed," he recalled. The Mason's first assignment, Convoy NY-119, was no proving ground. It was a crucible. They were escorting 76 unruly vessels from New York to Falmouth, England, in the fall of 1944. The convoy moved at a glacial pace, often below 5 knots. Then, the Great Atlantic Hurricane struck. The storm was an evil omen, a cataclysm of nature unleashed. Elmo Allen described the experience as like riding the Coney Island roller coaster standing up. Waves reached 60 to 80 feet, driven by 90-mile-per-hour winds. The Mason, a small destroyer escort, was tossed around like corks, enduring a terrifying 70-degree roll. The angry crest would tower over our bridge, which was itself 40 feet above the waterline. It would then lift the stern sky-high. The slide down into the trough was unnerving, with dark heaving water surrounding them completely. The crew worked with exemplary calm throughout the ordeal. Lorenzo A. Dufau noted that the calm that was among the crew members in the midst of this conflict was remarkable. "We would resort to trying to humor each other rather than being in fear," he remembered. They had plenty of reason for fear, however. The Mason sustained a 17-foot crack in its deck plates and took on 21 inches of water in its chain lockers. 2 larger British destroyers refused to venture out in the storm, but the Mason was dispatched to escort 20 smaller craft through the treacherous channel. Signalman James Dunn described the impossible task of rounding up ships like a shepherd rounding up his sheep. When the Mason finally completed its odyssey on October 20th, its performance was exemplary. The crew, against overwhelming odds, had proven their worth beyond question. Yet, the systemic prejudice persisted. The Mason's crew was recommended for a Navy commendation, but due to racial bias, the honor was not granted at the time. Ironically, the crew found the only place they were treated like real Americans was in Northern Ireland, where locals welcomed them as American fighting men. It was a stark contrast to the Jim Crow realities of home. The war, however, was not yet done extracting its toll. Even in the spring of 1945, the U-boat threat, though blunted, was not extinguished. Admiral Donitz ordered Operation Seawolf, sending snorkel-equipped U-boats to attack ruthlessly off the American coast. On April 24, 1945, 600 miles northwest of the Azores, the USS Frederick C. Davis, a destroyer escort crewed by many young men, was screening a convoy. William Reamer, the gunner's mate who knew only that the pointed end of the boat went first, was aboard. The night was cold, the sea a relentless, dark presence. U-546, commanded by Paul Just, was lurking below, its snorkel providing it air while remaining completely submerged. Suddenly, a silent, unseen acoustic torpedo shot out and struck the Davis on its port side. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Captain Just watched from the periscope as an avalanche of white gushing mass erupted from the stricken ship. Below deck, the explosion was a world-ending concussive force. The ship broke in two. It couldn't have been more evenly cut. Within 5 minutes, the bridge crew, including Lieutenant John F. McWhorter, were killed instantly. Cook Roy Adcock, blown onto the deck by the blast, found himself in the icy waters, using a frantic doggy paddle to reach a floater net. Survivors clung to debris, their teeth chattering uncontrollably, the cold seeping into their bones until blood was frozen in my veins. Then came the horror they had not anticipated. Sharks. Signalman Peter Karetka would never forget the sight of men beginning to squeal as the sharks hit them, forcing the living to watch as their shipmates disappeared beneath the surface. 77 men survived out of 192. The USS Flaherty, after rescuing some of the desperate survivors, was forced to leave others behind to pursue a new U-boat contact. This was the relentless, brutal calculus of the Atlantic War. The hunt for U-546 was a prolonged, tense battle where skilled sonar operators on the USS Janssen could almost tell what kind of evasive maneuvers that the sub was thinking. The relentless destroyer escorts finally cornered and sank U-546. When the German prisoners were taken aboard, Seaman Pellegrino Soriano observed that the Americans never maltreated them. He gained a whole new outlook that these people were human. They were afraid.
The sinking of the Frederick C. Davis, one of the last American combat ships lost to a U-boat, was a final grim testament to the enduring peril.
The destroyer escorts, the baby destroyers, initially dismissed by the brass, had been the crucial unheralded instrument of victory in the Atlantic. They neutralized the U-boat threat and ensured the Allied victory, a sacrifice measured in over 1,300 lost lives and the courage of young men who faced the abyss and endured. The neutralization of the U-boat threat, secured by the mass-produced destroyer escorts, did not end the war for the young sailors. It merely marked a geographic shift, trading the grueling green nightmare of the North Atlantic for the vast, deceptive calm of the Pacific. The destroyer escorts demonstrated their versatility, expanding their roles from pure anti-submarine warfare to include crucial anti-aircraft defense against an evolving, desperate enemy. The USS England quickly became the embodiment of the destroyer escort's new lethal effectiveness. In a mere 12-day campaign in May 1944, the England achieved the unthinkable, sinking 6 Japanese submarines. This combined effort, often involving other destroyer escorts like the George, Raby, and Spangler in gaining contact and tracking, effectively dismantled Tokyo's submarine scouting lines. The loss of these crucial intelligence-gathering vessels was a strategic blow that directly facilitated major American invasions of the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The destroyer escort was no longer just a defensive screen, it was a hunter-killer, paving the way for the advance across the Central Pacific. Yet, it was in the crucible of the Battle of Leyte Gulf that the destroyer escorts were asked to perform a function that defied all logic and standard naval doctrine.
They were ordered into a seemingly suicidal mission against overwhelming odds.
On October 25, 1944, off Samar, a small American force Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, found itself squarely in the path of a mammoth Japanese fleet. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, the Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond Dennis, and John C. Butler. They faced a vastly superior armada, 4 battleships, 9 heavy cruisers and 10 destroyers, including the 68,000-ton behemoth Yamato. The engagement began with terrifying suddenness. Sonarman Whitney Felt, aboard one of the escort carriers, recalled the whistling sound I'd never heard before. It was immediately followed by huge splashes nearby in the water, strangely colored green and blue and yellow, as the enemy shells began to bracket the small American ships. The Japanese armada was closing in at 30 knots. Captain Copeland, commander of the Roberts, received the order that would instantly be cemented in naval law. The destroyer escorts were to turn and fight. It was a David versus Goliath engagement, an act of sheer desperate sacrifice intended only to buy time for the escort carriers. The destroyer escorts charged straight toward the overwhelming Japanese fleet. They deployed every desperate tactic they possessed. White chemical smoke and thick black boiler smoke were poured into the air, creating a dense, opaque screen to hide the vulnerable carriers. They maneuvered wildly, their small size and agility suddenly becoming their greatest defense against the heavy, armor-piercing shells. The USS Raymond, its thin-skinned hull ill-suited to face battleships, fired over 1,413 rounds from its 5-inch guns. Vern Kimmel, the fire controlman, believed they scored many hits, though their shells were often seen bouncing harmlessly off the enemy's heavy armor. Yet the Raymond managed to evade a torpedo that passed right underneath us, a moment of terrifying luck. The USS Samuel B. Roberts closed to within 2,500 yards of the enemy, an almost unbelievable distance. Its crew, including young men like Charles W. Tuzel, who had quit high school to join the Navy, worked in a frenzy. They fired 275 rounds from the forward 5-inch gun and 300 from the aft. In the midst of the carnage, the aft 5-inch gun mount exploded. Paul Henry Carr, the captain of the gun, his body ripped open by shrapnel, focused his last moments on his duty, dying heroically while trying to load a shell, an act witnessed by Jack Hewson. Sam Blue, a fuel setter, was killed instantly, his dog, Sammy B., perishing beside him. The Japanese fire was relentless. The USS Dennis endured hits from 4 8-inch shells. One shell from the cruiser Tone ripped through its hull, narrowly missing Purcell Worley. The small ships were being hammered, but their resourcefulness paid dividends. Torpedoman striker Fred Graziano, only 19, and his shipmates fired their remaining torpedoes, convinced they had sunk a Japanese cruiser. The sheer tenacity and the sudden appearance of the small, aggressive American vessels, masked by the smoke and rain squalls, led the Japanese fleet to a critical miscalculation. They believed they were facing a larger, more formidable force of 4 or 5 fast carriers guarded by 1 or 2 battleships and at least 10 heavy cruisers. This critical misjudgment, coupled with the ferocious, seemingly suicidal American counterattack, saved the day. The Japanese commander, believing he was about to be flanked by a superior force, broke off the pursuit. The destroyer escorts, despite the loss of the Roberts and 2 destroyers, had averted a disaster, but the price was immense. That over 50 hours, the survivors of the sunken ships endured a harrowing ordeal, adrift in the Pacific. The sea, the ultimate enemy, now claimed its due. Richard Rhodey, a 19-year-old radio man, recalled the nights being horrible, with big seas running with big swells. The oil-covered survivors, clinging to debris, could only see the white eyeballs and teeth of their shipmates in the darkness.
The sharks arrived the next morning.
It was a horrible, horrible thing, as Jack Hewson recounted them hitting one of their own, forcing the survivors to make the agonizing decision to cut the man loose. Ernest Glenn Huffman admitted he was more afraid in the water than he had been during the battle. Captain Copeland of the Roberts suffered a mental breakdown, his muscular coordination gone, supported by his executive officer, Bob Roberts, as they battled the tide and current. Their only hope came when a Navy plane dipped its wings and gave a thumbs up, a gesture that brought them from the depths right up to the peaks. After days without food, subsisting only on contaminated water and malted milk tablets, they were finally sighted. When the rescue ship asked, "Who won the World Series?" a survivor, enraged by the triviality of the question, retorted, "Don't ask such goddamn fool questions. Pick us up." The Pacific Theater continued to test the destroyer escorts with desperate asymmetric warfare. The Japanese adopted suicidal tactics. The K-10, a one-man human torpedo carrying a 3,400-pound bomb, and the terrifying kamikaze attacks. Picket duty around Okinawa, along the perilous Bogey Highway, placed the destroyer escorts and destroyers at the forefront of the danger. On Mother's Day 1945, the USS Bright was on picket duty when a kamikaze made its run. Gunner's mate Charles R. Cox and Robert F. Thomas scored a direct hit, causing the plane to burst into flames, but its momentum carried it forward. It impacted the ship, and its 500-pound bomb exploded, buckling the main deck aft. The Gendreau, another destroyer escort, endured 5 kamikaze assaults in 2 months. Yeoman John A. Vyram, watching one attacker narrowly miss the ship's antenna, was struck by the attacker's youth. They were kids just like us, he realized. In one engagement, a kamikaze hit the Gendreau directly, leaving the ship dead in the water, a choking, acrid odor filling the passageways. Beyond the enemy, the destroyer escorts faced a force that demanded as much courage as any battle line: nature itself. Typhoon Cobra, known as Halsey's Typhoon, struck the fleet with the fury of a grueling green nightmare. Ships were tossed around as though they were nothing more than balsa wood models. The USS Tabora, a destroyer escort, rolled more than 70 degrees, its towering 93-foot mast cracking and buckling under the strain. Captain Henry Lee Plage declared, "It was every man for himself, practically." Walter Roberge, who had lied about his age to join the Navy, was aboard the USS Swearer, which rolled up to 73 degrees. He stared into the swirling abyss, contemplating whether to go over the side with his shoes on or off. The winds howled at 150 miles per hour. Bulkheads creaked and groaned, and water rushed into ventilators, killing power, steering, and lights. 3 American destroyers were lost, over 100 aircraft swept into the sea, and nearly 800 men perished. Roberge, a veteran of the Atlantic, stated that hurricanes there were like a stroll in the park compared to these Pacific typhoons. The sheer power of the elements underscored the constant peril of naval service. Captain Plage, defying orders to speed to a rendezvous, chose instead to search for survivors, eventually saving 55 men from the wreckage of the USS Hull and the USS Spence. The young crews of the destroyer escorts, whether battling the Yamato or the 90-foot waves of a typhoon, were locked in a war fought against nature itself, their survival hinging on their resilience, their agility, and the steadfastness of the little ships that could. They were the unsung heroes of both oceans, their sacrifices foundational to Allied victory. The war finally staggered to a close, not with a sudden clean break, but with a protracted grinding finality. Even as Allied victory in Europe neared, the U-boat menace, though diminished, persisted. Admiral Donitz's final order for Operation Seawolf was a desperate, doomed gesture, resulting in the destruction of 9 Nazi U-boats off Norway. But the final, lethal dance continued off the American coast, a stark reminder that the silent, invisible war under the sea was not over until the last torpedo was fired. The USS Atherton and the USS Moberly, 2 destroyer escorts, delivered the final blow to the German threat in United States waters. On May 5, 1945, near Rhode Island, they hunted U-853, which had just torpedoed the SS Black Point, the last United States flag merchant vessel sunk in the war. Captain Iselin of the Atherton ordered the drop of 13 magnetic depth charges. The resulting debris oil, wood, escape lungs, and a captain's hat confirmed the kill. The headline that followed was grimly conclusive: 200 depth charges beat a Davy Jones dirge for last U-boat bagged off East Coast. But the end of the shooting war did not mean the end of the psychological and physical toll. For the young men who had endured the grueling green nightmare of the North Atlantic and the kamikaze-strewn skies of the Pacific, the trauma lingered deep. Enz Rulof F. Kipp, a survivor of the Frederick C. Davis sinking, was recommended for a Purple Heart after his ordeal in the icy water. They credited his Princeton letter sweater with saving his life. Decades later, Kipp discovered the recommendation had never been acted upon. This was a clear failure of bureaucracy to recognize the sheer bravery of the destroyer escort sailors. He finally received his honor years later. He wore that same sweater, a poignant symbol of a debt unpaid. The historical record, compiled in the chaos of wartime, was often as fractured and incomplete as the ships that limped back to port. For years, the official assessment of U-boat losses was considered definitive, yet, It denied recognition to crews who knew, in their bones, exactly what they had accomplished. One such injustice centered on the fate of U-8669 on an overcast evening in February of 1945. 65 miles off the coast of New Jersey, the USS Crow was on patrol. 22-year-old Coast Guard sonarman Howard Kenneth Denson had rejected the merchant marine specifically for the chance at action. They was confined to the dark, humming sonar shack. Then he heard the unmistakable sound. It was a ping that indicated a moving target. U-8609, commanded by Captain Helmut Neuerberg. The Crow immediately engaged, pursuing the U-boat for over 3 miles as it dashed for deeper water. Denson, unable to see the action, could only imagine the violence unfolding above and below the surface. 24 75-pound hedgehogs were fired, followed by multiple depth charges. The resulting underwater explosions were so concussive that, according to ship's carpenter's mate Robert Quigley, they seemed to lift the entire stern of the ship out of the water. Theodore Seviek, an 18-year-old gunner's mate, fired the first hedgehog. He watched, transfixed, as moving bubbles and oil surfaced tangible proof of a kill, later confirmed by rags soaked in oil brought back by a whaleboat crew. Despite the eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence gathered at sea, the Navy's official assessment was dismissive. A senior officer from the USS Koina ruled the target a wreck, or simply a non-sub. The Crow's victory was erased from history. Denson, Seviek, and Quigley carried that knowledge and the sting of being discredited for decades. They knew they had sunk a moving enemy and likely prevented an attack on convoy Cu-58. 46 years later, in 1991, the truth finally surfaced from the deep. Divers discovered the wreckage of U-869 at a depth of 230 feet off Point Pleasant, New Jersey. The submarine was intact enough to yield skeletal remains of its crew and irrefutable artifacts. These included crockery bowls dated 1942, with the eagle and swastika markings, a dinner knife bearing the name Horenberg, and a box of spare parts with a brass plate inscribed U-869. The forensic evidence was conclusive. Axel Niestel, the leading German authority on U-boat losses, was forced to amend his assessment. He officially credited the USS Crow and USS Koina with the sinking on February 11, 1945. The experts concluded that no U-boat is known to have survived a direct hedgehog hit, confirming the Crow's initial attack had fatally wounded the submarine, with the depth charges finishing the job. The discovery was a profound vindication. It offered long overdue recognition to the aging heroes of the USS Crow. It underscored the crucial role of individual eyewitness accounts and later forensic evidence in correcting the historical inaccuracies that had plagued the destroyer escort narrative. The drive for recognition did not end with the Crow. The sailors of the USS Mason, the first warship manned by a predominantly black crew, had performed with exemplary courage during the Great Atlantic Hurricane in 1944. Their recommendation for a Navy commendation was stalled and denied due to racial prejudice. It took 50 years and the tireless work of historian Mary Pat Kelly to right that wrong. In 1995, President Bill Clinton honored the living African-American sailors of the Mason. He finally acknowledged their foundational sacrifice and skill. The newspaper headline that followed succinctly captured the victory. Irish first to treat USS Mason crew like real Americans. The enduring resolve of the destroyer escort veterans, now in the twilight of their lives, became focused on a tangible legacy. They wanted to preserve the memory of the mighty little ship that could. They formed the Destroyer Escort Sailors Association and the Destroyer Escort Historical Foundation, led by veterans like historian Martin Davis and gunner's mate Sam Saylor. Their target was the USS Slater, one of the 563 destroyer escorts built during the war, which had been transferred to Greece. When the Greeks decided to scrap the rusty old ship, the veterans mobilized. They negotiated for its release, agreeing to pay the $275,000 cost of towing the vessel from the Isle of Crete back to the United States. The journey was a financial and logistical feat, funded entirely by veterans and sympathetic individuals. When the Slater finally arrived, engines silent and paint peeling, at the Intrepid Sea Air Space Museum in New York City, it was a dream come true for the misty-eyed destroyer escort veterans. A few years later, the Slater needed a new home and was towed upriver to Albany, New York. Mayor Jennings, initially skeptical of having a rusty old war relic along its water front, changed his mind instantly upon seeing the excited reaction of the World War II veterans assembled to greet the Slater. He saw not a derelict hull, but a living monument to service. Under the leadership of restoration expert Tim Rizzuto, and with the relentless dedication of volunteers, many of them World War II veterans themselves, the Slater underwent an extensive restoration. The ship was returned precisely to its original wartime configuration. It became a grey ghost from the past, now made whole. Today, the USS Slater stands as the last World War II destroyer escort still afloat. Its silence is a profound testament to the noise of battle. It is a living legacy, educating over 15,000 visitors annually about the experience of living, eating, sleeping, and fighting on board these tiny warships. The adaptability and obedience Lieutenant Harold Poulsen observed in his teenage crew in 1945, their victory and preservation ensures that the story of the destroyer escorts, the overlooked heroes who were foundational to Allied victory, will never be forgotten. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.